Congratulations. If you're watching this, then that means you let your morbid curiosities get the best of you, which makes you a horrible person. And that's totally fine. Between us, I've been told I'm a little rough around the edges myself, and sometimes we shouldn't take these things to heart. What's important is that you're here, and I'm here, and we have a lot to talk about. So without going any further, truly, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being a piece of shit. Before we go any further tonight, I just wanted to say that by the end of this video, for those of you that stick around together, we will talk about some of the most sickeningly deplorable actions ever committed by a YouTuber. Like the fact that this guy has been able to go on unchecked is beyond me. So I'm sure we can all agree that some things just can't be unseen. Like, I don't care how tough you are, you could kick puppies around as a recreational sport. We all still at least have that one thing that shakes us at our core. And then there's people like, yeah, I'm so desensitized, I'm cringing, I've seen it all. Like, we don't care if you give off weirdest person in Walmart at 3 a.m. energy, the statement still stands for you. The truth is that no matter what the worst case we've ever come across or the worst thing we've ever heard about on the internet is, there's always some fresh hell right down the road. And you, like myself, are still human, so let's have a few human minutes together and acknowledge that what we're about to see is horrible. I'm sure most of you already know what an iceberg chart is, so I won't go into too much detail explaining it, but basically how it normally works is that entries closer to the top are typically surface level, stuff you probably already know about, and as you get lower, entries become more obscure. Well, I personally made this one a little different. Together, we'll start at the top, which is already horrible, and learn about some of the real-life cases that inspired movies and scary stories that gave us nightmares from childhood until now. From there, we'll work our way through everything from mass casualty events that shaped our world the way it is today, to the monsters that might be under your bed right now. And speaking of monsters that might be under your bed right now, that brings us to today's sponsor, Bad Dragon. Jokes. I'm not actually sponsored by Bad Dragon. But still, yes, everything on here is horrible. I mean, you're horrible, I'm horrible, this iceberg is horrible, and it would be empirically valid for you to hate me for creating such a monstrosity. So once we get through that, then we'll be getting on to some of the entries that are a bit more mysterious in nature, and the severity just kind of amps up from there. Seriously, the closer we get to the bottom, the more our collective mental health is going to deteriorate, and some of us are probably going to cry. Which is okay, this is a safe place, and I've come prepared for that sort of thing. Just be aware that this series is spread out into over a dozen videos, and there's really no easing someone into true crime. The entries start from bad and they get progressively worse, so if you're already having regrets, try your best to get used to it, because it's all downhill from here. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's get our favorite snack, some music going, and let's begin. To begin our journey, we'll need to travel to one of the states people commonly forget about, Missouri. On March 21st, 1936, Janett Christman was born to parents Charles and Lula. Eventually, the family relocated from Boonville to Columbia, Missouri, both being notably small towns, especially at that time. The family opened a small cafe in which Janett, her parents, and two younger sisters lived above, and as soon as she was old enough, she began helping out with the family business. By 1950, at age 13, she started babysitting for family friends to earn some cash. The two families that used her services the most being the Romacks and the Muellers. On the night of March 18th, 1950, Janett planned to attend a school dance with friends. However, she reconsidered after being offered a night's pay by the Romacks to watch their 3-year-old son. Being the hard-working young lady she was known to be, she chose to babysit instead of going to the dance. The night was frigid, with temperatures dropping below 20 degrees Fahrenheit and a constant downpour of rain and hail. It became such a cliche for horror stories to be set on a stormy night, so of course reality couldn't help but follow that trend. Around 7 p.m., she made her way from her family's cafe to the Romax isolated house on the outskirts of Columbia. So as if the scene couldn't have been set any better, we've got a young girl heading to babysit in a rural old house on a dark and stormy night. I'm beginning to see why this case inspired so many movies. Upon arrival, Janett was given a quick rundown on how to operate the family's shotgun by Ed Romack, while his wife Anne shut all of the window curtains. Ed placed the shotgun next to the front door and instructed Janett to keep the porch light off unless someone knocked. Before leaving, they told her to keep the radio on as it helped their son stay asleep. They then left to meet up with the other family Janett regularly babysat for, the Muellers. That'll be important in a few minutes. It's safe to assume that for the first few hours, everything went as planned. However, at 10 p.m., a frantic call came into 911 of a young girl screaming, come quick," before abruptly disconnecting. So back then, especially in small towns, it was unfortunately commonplace to have dispatchers in a different location from the switchboard they would have needed to trace the landline. And unfortunately, even if they weren't several miles away from it like they were in this case, they simply wouldn't have had enough time to do so. So without the address, the dispatcher wasn't able to send police to answer the call for help. Several times beyond that point throughout the night, Anne attempted to call home to get an update from Janett. Every call was directed to a busy signal. Anne would later say that she assumed Janett was just on the phone with some friends, or that maybe she'd forgotten to put it back on the receiver. Regardless, they must not have thought too much of this because they didn't make their way home until around 1:30 in the morning. As soon as their house came into view, they knew something was wrong. Ed quickly parked the car and Anne ran out towards the door. Racing across the yard, I can only imagine what was going through this lady's head when she approached the house, wondering why all of the curtain blinds were open. She'd specifically made sure they were all closed before she left for the evening, and as weird as that wasn't what sent immediate alarm bells off in their heads. No. What had Anne so shaken, and Ed was slowly catching on, was remembering that they told her to keep the porch light off, but it was on, and that meant that someone had knocked. Fumbling around for the keys, they went to unlock the door only to have their worst fears reaffirmed when they found that it wasn't necessary. Though nothing could have prepared them for opening the door and seeing Janett on the living room floor in front of the family's piano in a pool of blood with an electrical cord wrapped around her neck. Alright, so I have to be really careful with this next part, as well as other things like this, because as we know, YouTube doesn't like certain things a lot more than they don't like others, but she was left with her legs spread in a position that insinuated that she was assaulted in the worst way possible. She'd received heavy blunt force trauma to the head and chest and showed signs of a struggle at various other points. Like stated previously, she'd been strangled with part of a cord from the Romax clothing iron, and a rather odd but important detail is that she'd been punctured repeatedly with a mechanical pencil, and we'll speak more on that in a minute. The phone she'd used to call for help was several feet away from her on the ground, and as any parent would do upon seeing a girl's lifeless body that they'd just paid to babysit their child, they went into hysterics and ran upstairs hoping against hope that their toddler was okay. And in a strange but thankful twist, their son was unharmed, asleep in his bed, completely oblivious to the horrors downstairs. Their house being on the outskirts of town was covered between two jurisdictions, so officers from both agencies responded. We'll get into it more a little later and in another entry further down the iceberg, but this would turn out to be a fatal flaw in the investigation. They'd found bloody handprints on the walls and furniture throughout several points in the house, and items thrown about indicating that Janett fought as hard as she could. The back door was wide open, and a back window was busted in with a garden hose that the Romax said were positive was outside of the house when they left. I personally believe that this was a diversion to get police to focus around the back of the house and that back window being smashed instead of the front door. Actually, no, we're going to get into that right now. As previously stated, all of the window curtains had been opened around the front of the house. The porch light was on, the door was unlocked, and the shotgun was untouched. One would think the logical deduction from any of these facts would indicate that not only did she turn the porch light on, as it wouldn't have made sense for her attacker to draw outside attention, and she didn't touch the shotgun. So far, all of the details point to what is, in my opinion, the most terrifying and depressing possibility of all. She not only knew who knocked on the front door, but she knew them well enough to feel unthreatened letting them inside in the middle of the night. I believe I'll provide all of the evidence needed for my theory in a minute, but first let's see how the investigation was going. Bloodhounds were able to track a scent all the way up to the road, but due to the heavy storm, they'd lost it. Not surprisingly, the two agencies couldn't agree on anything the crime scene indicated aside from which way they left down the street, and that's because the dogs led them there. One agency attempted to start interviewing those close to Janett, while the others, unironically, literally, they rounded up as many black men in the community as they could under the claim that they were following leads given by the community. Okay, and obviously reports conflict here, but I've seen that they arrested over 20 men as a result for committing unrelated crimes. Frankly, it sounds like the sheriff was just botching a little girl's justice for the sake of being a racist. Anyways, the case remains to this day as cold as the night it happened. There were several people of interest that popped up, but thanks to the negligence and bias of police, no one ever faced justice for what they did to her. Now it's time for us to use our deductive reasoning skills as well as a little bit of hindsight to see where the police messed up. If you'll remember earlier, Janett frequently babysat for two families, and both couples were going out together that night. Robert Mueller, the head of household for the other family, had contacted Janett that morning and asked if she'd be willing to babysit, though she told him no on account of her still planning to attend the dance. When Ed Romack contacted her later that day with an offer she couldn't refuse, she said yes, and Ed told police that Robert aired out his frustration over it several times throughout dinner, a dinner which Robert excused himself from, leaving his wife with the Romacks shortly before 10 and didn't return for about an hour and a half. So that's strike one, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt for now. Going back to one of the more unusual details, Janett was repeatedly punctured with a mechanical pencil. Would y'all care to guess who the only person in town known to regularly carry a mechanical pencil was? Because it was the 1950s and that shit wasn't common. People actually made jokes about him for it, being in a rural Missouri town and all. So that's strike two. Basically, if the cops would have been playing baseball instead of rounding up black guys, Bobby Boy would have been struck out because in the very early morning hours, while police were still processing the scene, Robert Mueller called the home of Ed and Ann Romack to ask Ed if he needed help cleaning up the blood from a murder he should have had no way of knowing about yet. Like, they didn't tell anybody about this yet. This is hours after. Yeah, I feel pretty confident that Robert did it, but the guy's dead now, so I suppose it's in God's hands. Let me know what you think in the comments, and we'll continue. Despite the police dropping the ball, Janett's case would go on to directly inspire several Hollywood movies, the most notable of which being the original and decades later the remake for When a Stranger Calls, solidifying paranoia in babysitters for generations to come. So for this next one, we'll need a little bit of backstory. In 1987, police responded to 2,795 instances of violent crime among Chicago's housing projects, putting it among the most dangerous areas in the country. The Alba high-rise buildings were frequently said to be the worst of them, regularly referred to as the urban inferno. To Ruthie Mae McCoy, a resident on the 11th floor of one of these buildings, existence was frequently taken over by paranoia. And rightfully so, given that her building had at least one murder, 4 reported SAs, and over a dozen robberies a week on average. And sometimes those numbers could be as high as 3 or 4 times more. The hallways frequently housed the area's homeless. The units had rats, roaches, spiders, and worse, it was an unfortunate but common practice for tenants to barricade their bathroom doors from the outside before they slept or left home. We'll get into that in a minute, But first, let's talk a bit more about Ruthie. By all accounts, she had trouble interacting with people in public. She was so paranoid of those around her that if anyone got too close, she'd yell obscenities at them. One of her more alarming but well-intended practices was her morning routine, where she'd walk the halls of her building, jiggling doorknobs and chastising anyone who left theirs unlocked. It wasn't uncommon for her to enter any units that weren't unlocked and berate the tenants until they called police to have her to leave. This happened so often that she was on a first-name basis with many of the responding officers, at which point they'd escort her back to her unit, tell her not to do it again even though they knew she'd do it again, and leave. Little did she know that locked doors would be the least of her problems. On the night of April 22nd, 1987, Ruthie went into her bathroom to start her nightly routine, and she heard something odd. It sounded as if people were having a whispered conversation behind her bathroom mirror. Now, Ruthie was a normal donor to many televangelists for having her prayers answered, but Ruthie, in her particular mixture of street smarts and paranoia, understood she wasn't hearing angels. Frantic, she ran into her kitchen to the phone and made a chilling call to 911. Her choice of words confused the operator as she was saying the next door neighbor was climbing through her medicine cabinet mirror, stating that they wanted to get inside of her apartment. The dispatcher must have not attempted to make much sense of what she was hearing, because the call ended and she marked it up as a dispute with neighbors. Minutes after, 2 more phone calls came into 911, reported yelling, followed by several gunshots coming from apartment 1109. Officers responded shortly after, knocking on the door but got no response. Given the current political climate and environment they were in, the police made the mistake of refusing to breach the door. It's debatable whether or not the decision would have saved her life, as medical examiners determined that the possibility was there but unlikely that she would have survived a few minutes after being shot. However, what we do know as fact is this. When police knocked on Ruthie's door, her killers were still inside, basically ransacking her apartment for anything of value. The police, after waiting for what I at least hope were a few minutes, decided to leave. They were called back the next day and discouraged by housing authority security on forcing entry into the unit due to risk of a lawsuit. So after knocking for a bit, they once again left. It wouldn't be until almost 2 entire days had passed when police came along with maintenance men for the building and drilled a hole into the door. The responding officers said what they found next was expected, but no less shocking. Which begs the question that if they'd expected there to be a dead lady in the apartment, why the hell didn't they just go in, like right after the first call? Regardless, Ruthie's body had already progressed into decaying due to the heat, and I'm not going to go into detail because of YouTube, but it really wasn't pretty. The 2 men that did it, quote unquote, allegedly did it, not only sold items said to belong to her within the following days of her death, but also one of them bragged to his girlfriend about shooting an old lady in the face. You'd think that that would be a decent enough admission of guilt along with selling a bunch of her stuff, but apparently not, because they weren't found guilty. Ruthie was one of 3 people murdered in her building that week, and cops went on record to say that half a dozen violent crimes a month in the Alba high-rise was a slow month. And what's crazier is she'd been in constant contact with housing authority about moving to a different location because of the hazards, specifically the likelihood that she would fall victim to a home invasion via the maintenance holes behind the bathroom mirrors in those units. Which is why, unless in use, most of the time in the Alba housing projects as well as those surrounding them, they frequently barricaded the bathroom doors. She was set to move into a safer residence closer to her grandkids 2 weeks from the night she died. This case is a prime example of systemic poverty and uncompromising bias on those in charge of keeping these people safe. Ruthie's death would go on to inspire the Candyman franchise. This next entry won't be as long because, disgustingly, we don't know much. And to be honest, it's on this layer and not further down because I really want to talk about it. For my fellow parents out there, what would you do if the police wrote your child's sudden disappearance off as a runaway? I'm willing to bet you'd raise hell. So for this entry, I won't be telling you a story. I'll simply be giving you the facts as we know them. 34 years ago, on the night of March 18th, 1990, 15-year-old fraternal twins, Janett and Janett Millbrook, went missing in Augusta, Georgia. But the case only gained actual attention a few years ago thanks to the Fall Line podcast's coverage. What we know is this: the school they had to go to had recently changed, and there weren't any school buses that picked up in that area. So instead of making the several-mile walk to school, they sought out family members for a bit of cash for the bus fare to get there and home. And on this day in particular, after they'd gotten home from school, they were sent out to go and get some food for the family's dinner. They were given money by their uncle, and then at which point they went to another family member's house to ask if they would walk home with them, because it's speculated that there was a white van following them several days prior. At least they told their mother so. With the family member unable to walk them home due to being alone with a newborn, the twins would then walk from there to a nearby gas station, and then they would both vanish, never to be seen again. The situation that followed, and to this day, is profoundly a miscarriage of, let me say it again, a miscarriage of justice. Once it got dark, the family's concern heightened as they began to search for the twins, at which point Detective Jim Shipp, and this guy's gonna come up a few times, told the family that they needed to wait 24 hours before reporting the twins missing. The family reported them missing the moment the 24-hour period had ended, because they were still looking, they still didn't find them, ergo the girls are missing. And then police immediately labeled them as runaways. Specifically, Detective Jim Shipp, who went on record locally to say, "I'm not surprised the girls ran away from a ghetto like that." Detective Shipp would prove to be the primary roadblock for the investigation to be opened by police for years to come. On the girl's 17th birthday, he went so far as to personally contact the family, informing them that now that the twins were of age of consent, even if the police found them, they couldn't be forced to come back, and they couldn't even notify the family. Yeah, Jim, that totally sounds like protecting and serving your community. And a few years later, what does Jim, the racist piece of garbage, Shipp do? He falsifies information that the twins were found in order to get them taken off of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's database, officially closing any eyes the federal government could have had on this case by marking them found in the records of their disappearance, which of course we know to this day to be false. And if all of that doesn't seem like a cover-up, let's talk about a friend of their father's who goes by the name Ernest. Ernest's daughter reached out to set up a phone meeting between them. The audio is a little bad, but I figured it would be beneficial for us to hear what he had to say. This is the phone conversation between the documentary crew and Ernest in prison. For those watching the video and not the podcast, subtitles will be included.
So, you got the floor, man. Tell me something good, Ernest. Tell me something good, brother. Uh-huh. You know, they came down there seeing their dad or whatever. You know, Third Street was a drug area. They was so great. Everybody so great. Uh-huh. I was young and I was in the dope game and I worked for one of the dope riders. I was never like 12 years old. I was selling dope for one of the big dudes riding. But I ain't know what the girls were, but you don't see something, you don't say that because a stage get put in the ditch back in the 90s. So that's how it went down. I understand. Now let me tell you this right here. When I heard folks going out in their house, in their dad's house, you know he was a junkie. You know he was a junkie. He was a crackhead.
You talking about John? So John Millbrook, you say he was a crackhead.
the one saying that she said something. And let's just say one of them notes shook. And I guess she hit the table. And I think she pushed the head over on the table.
You saw the girl when she got hit and hit the table?
Yeah.
And her sister was there?
Yeah.
How many men were in the house?
When that bitch started going down in the house, after them girls screamed, that's when they told everybody to leave. The thing is, every wife, they told everybody to see it come back. Now, I'm gonna tell you now, to be honest, I don't think them girls are alive.
Who told everyone to leave?
Do you know where the bodies are?
For sure, but I can give you an area back then where they used to put the bodies in. And that's why I'm trying to tell y'all I ain't gonna do this. Because a lot of stuff can hit the fan.
No, I understand.
They used to go put them over there in Augusta. They got a little spot over there called Every Brother Brickyard. And they used to hide bodies over there.
Do you know any of them old cats that owned a white van?
Yeah, like what? That was a street thing. Don't think you gotta do is ask the police in Augusta who was about it back in the day. All you don't know what.
I just can't come there when I start talking to people in high places. I just can't give them a general story. I gotta have something that's gonna have some power to it, where they're gonna say, okay, give me a name of one of the cats that was there, or one of the cats that had their way with one of them girls. Something concrete I can sink my teeth into, Ernest. I need that from you, brother.
Alright. Little cheese.
What?
Little cheese. Like cheese you eat.
Okay.
Little cheese.
Yeah, that's my nephew.
He was there?
Yes, sir.
Was he one of the ones that had his way with one of these twins?
Yep.
But you don't know his real name, you just know a nickname, Lil Cheese.
Yeah.
And what about John? What about their father? He never said anything?
I think that's what drove John crazy. I think that's what really drove that man crazy.
So first off, and this is my favorite part about the first 48 as well, the nicknames that thugs give each other is crazy. He specifically named a guy named Lil Cheese and asked police. And when asked, police admitted that someone who went by that name was a big troublemaker in the area, especially around that time. With Ernest also giving them the location he believed the girls could be found in, surely the police couldn't ignore that information, right? Well, the Augusta, Georgia PD decided to pay Ernest a visit shortly after the interview, to which they told the family Ernest told them everything and that it was a productive day, at which point they made an official announcement that Ernest had been confusing the twins with another double homicide and that there were no tangible factors, despite Ernest giving names, dates, and locations, and being a friend of their father's, at which point Ernest went completely silent towards the film crew with no explanation. It would later come out that Ernest had been forced by police into saying he'd made the whole thing up. And sadly, this is where what we know ends. There was an active serial killer who was convicted of the essay and murder of 5 women who all fit the same description of the twins just 5 years later. One victim being abducted from the same convenience store that they were last seen at. But the police must have felt like they deserved to get paid for sitting on their butts all day because they did nothing with that lead. They never tried to make the connection. This case truly disgusts me, and I'm already having anxiety knowing that we have like a lot to go. This next case, as well as one of the other entries on the part 2 to this layer, are very similar in that they are both extremely messed up and they both may or may not have inspired Friday the 13th. I say may or may not because both the director and production company deny the allegations of inspiration by these cases, but like, given the point of time the original draft of the movie started being developed, I respect the decision to say that the movie came from pure imagination, but after this we can probably make our own assumptions. Anyways, let's get into it. Less than 2 months before any of the kids would arrive at Camp Scott in Oklahoma, during an on-site training session, a counselor discovered that her belongings had been ransacked and her donuts had been stolen. This alone would have been enough to upset anyone, but what happened next took things to another level. Inside the empty donut box, there were handwritten notes. Several of these pages contained like schizo writing with like kill, kill, kill written all over the pages. Another stating in capital letters, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. The director of the camp session treated these notes as a prank, and it was discarded. That was a decision that would later prove to be among the worst that camp director would ever make. Fast forwarding to the morning of June 13th, 1977, a counselor making their rounds went around to all of the tents in the Kiowa camp to wake the girls up. Tent 8, where Lori, Michelle, and Denise slept, being the last and most secluded, it was actually the only tent that wasn't in view of the rest. More importantly, it was the furthest from the counselor's tent. Immediately, the counselor knew something horrible had happened, given the girls nor their sleeping bags were inside. In there were basically like belongings strewn all over the place, and a lot of blood. Like, a lot of blood. I've seen the pictures. No, you don't need to see the pictures. We'll leave it at that. Running around to look for them, a short distance off to the side of the trail were the bodies of Lori Lee Farmer, age 8, Michelle Heather Goose, I probably mispronounced that name, I'm sorry, age 9, and Doris Denise Milner, age 10, piled on top of each other in their sleeping bags. Again, I'm not going into any details, but their bodies were mangled, to put it as mildly as possible. Unfortunately, it's safe to assume that they had all suffered greatly before passing. This revelation would cause several to come forward saying that they'd heard noises after midnight that sound like a mixture of a coyote and a foghorn, which makes the situation all the more heartbreaking. This would skyrocket the efforts for an already ongoing manhunt in the surrounding areas for an escaped prisoner by the name of Gene Leroy Hart. Long story short, this guy did it. The evidence was overwhelming against him. He had items from the tent along with the newspaper that was found at his camp, being the missing pages to the newspaper that was stuffed inside of a flashlight found at the crime scene. Like, it's just overwhelmingly obvious that this guy killed those little girls, but for some odd reason, the jury found him not guilty and he was acquitted of all charges. And then he was brought back to jail to serve the rest of his sentence he'd broken out from. He definitely served a jail sentence, just not the one he should have for what he did to those little girls, and unfortunately, they did not see justice in a court of law. It only salts the wound at this point, but modern DNA tests matched him to several of the remaining pieces of evidence, confirming popular suspicion far too late. Not that it would have mattered, because the biggest double-edged sword in the US judicial system, also known as double jeopardy, is and was a thing. So, in my notes for this one, I guess I forgot to elaborate because all I have written down is, and I quote, "What kind of daddy grandpa shit is this?" So for the sake of time management, I believe I've memorized enough to give you the facts. Joseph Fritzl, as some of us may know, is a giant piece of garbage. The guy basically abducted his 18-year-old daughter Elizabeth and held her captive in his labyrinth of a basement for over 20 years. He forced her to bear his children, several of which died due to medical complications, and several other he actually staged to appear as if they were dropped off on his doorstep by his daughter, who quote-unquote ran away so that Joseph and his wife could adopt and raise them. How this guy got away with this for as long as he did is beyond me, and I really don't remember well enough, but his wife had to be in on it. Like, there's no way she didn't know something was going on for over 20 years, and thankfully, Elizabeth and her remaining children were able to escape. For some of them, it would be the first glimpse they'd ever experienced of daylight. It still makes me feel gross to know that Joseph is still alive. The guy's like 89, 90 years old, and I feel like the situation should have sorted itself out by now. Further down the iceberg, we'll be talking about cases eerily similar to this one, but without getting into it now, you'll understand why they're further down when the time comes. Entirely too many people have seen Markiplier in the corner of their room during sleep paralysis. It's becoming entirely too large of an issue to ignore or make jokes about. With that being said, I've created a change.org petition that'll be linked in the description, and if enough people sign it, he'll hopefully cut it out. To those of you who have made it this far, thank you. Truly. Part 2 will be posted very soon, and I hope to see you back. Good night.